Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
Macros help us automate repetitive tasks, giving you more time to focus on the really important stuff. And all a macro really is a recording of different steps, different commands that you execute in Excel, converted to VBA code, which we can then rerun at a later time on different data. So for example, if maybe each week you receive a report from a colleague and you have to go through and tidy up that report. Maybe you have to remove the blank rows. Maybe you have to apply number formatting to particular columns. Maybe you need to add and format a heading and then maybe print that report. Well, instead of doing all of those repetitive tasks each week, you could create a macro which you can click on, which will execute all of those steps for you. So macros are effectively a really great time-saving feature. And throughout the balance of this section, I'm going to show you how you can record some simple to more complex macros, how you can understand the basics of VBA code, and I'm going to show you how you can make your macros really user-friendly and how you can create your own macro ribbons to make them easy to access. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's just take a look at some macros in action so you can understand exactly what they do. And I have quite a few examples in this workbook of useful macros. Now, one thing you have to remember with macros is that you're going to find them on the Developer tab. So once again, if you don't have this Developer tab turned on, then you're going to need to go into Excel options like we did for form controls and make sure that you have a tick in the box. Once you do, you're going to be able to see this first group here called code, and this basically contains all of the commands you need to run and execute macros. Now, for the time being, or for at least this lesson, we don't really need this because I've already created the macros for each of these worksheets. And if you're curious as to where those macros are housed, if we click on the macros button, you can see the different macros that I have set up in this workbook. So what we're going to do is we're going to run each of these so you can see how they work. So this first macro, this is going to help me delete all the blank rows from this data set. So you can see that we have a few blank rows running throughout this data set, and it might be that I have a worksheet that has thousands of rows that I quickly want to remove the blank rows from. Now, because I've set this up in a macro, all I need to do is click on the macros button, find the correct macro, which is this one here, delete blank rows, and click on run. And would you take a look at that? Like magic, all of those blank rows have now been deleted. On the next worksheet, I want to apply a counting format to columns D all the way across to column J. Currently, the values in these columns just have general formatting applied. And I want to change this to a counting format. Now, I've already set up a macro to do this, so if we jump into the Developer ribbon, open up Macros, it's this one just here, a counting format. Now, you're going to see a few easier ways of executing these macros as we go through this section. You're not expected to come into this macro area each time, find the macro and click on Run, because you can use a keyboard shortcut or you can assign it to the Quick Access toolbar. But we're going to talk about that a bit later on. For the time being, let's just run them from here. So I'm going to select Accounting Format and click on the Run button. Now notice it's only applied Accounting Format to the cell I was clicked on. So another really important point about macros, make sure that you select the cell range that you want to run them on. So Control-Shift down, that looks pretty good. Let's rerun that macro. And now I have accounting format applied to all of those cells. Let's jump across to the next worksheet. In this example, I want to format this data as a table. Let's open up our macros. Let's find the correct macro, which is this one just here, Format as Table, and click on Run. Hopefully you're seeing how much quicker this can be. What about if I want to do things like apply conditional formatting? Well, I can do that too using a macro. All I need to do here is select the range that I want to apply the data bars to, and then I can go into macros, let's choose the data bars macro and click on Run. I can also use a macro to remove all hyperlinks from these URLs. So I'm going to select the range, open up macros, and this time we're going to choose Remove Hyperlink. As you can see, it makes automating all of these types of tasks a lot quicker. Now we're just doing single tasks here, and we are going to look at a more complex example as we go through this section. But let's take a look at a couple more examples. What about if I want to apply some conditional formatting? Well, we have a macro for that. I can select all of the data, go to macros, let's choose highlight cells and click on Run. So this macro is highlighting all cells that are greater than $9,000. What about this next one? Here we want to calculate the percentage of profit to revenue. And notice that I have a button just above that says Calculate Percentage. Now what this means is that all I need to do is highlight the cells and I can just click Calculate Percentage and I get the result that I'm looking for. And we're also going to see how we can assign macros to buttons in this section as well. Now the final macro I have in here, which I haven't yet showed you, is the new worksheet macro. Because we can use macros to do things like create new workbooks. If I run this one, notice that at the bottom I now have a new worksheet called Sheet 1. So those are some really nice examples of how you can use or how you can incorporate macros into your daily work to streamline your workflow and automate repetitive tasks. The beauty of macros is that we don't need to know anything about coding in order to create them, because we have the macro recorder. Now, the macro recorder simply records our actions, our steps, and it converts it to VBA code. So all we need to do is save the macro and then we can reuse it. And when you run a macro, it's basically just rerunning the recorded steps. So we're going to take a look at a few examples of this in this section. And I'm going to show you exactly how easy it is to automate your repetitive tasks. Now, when it comes to recording macros, there are a few different places where you can go to turn on your macro recorder. Now, you can find the macro recorder on the Developer tab. So again, make sure that you have that tab turned on. In the first group, the Code group, we have a Record Macro button just here. So you can start your recorder by clicking on this button. The second place you can go to start recording a macro is on the View ribbon. All the way at the end, we have a Macros group, and if we click the drop down, we have a Record Macro button in there as well. And the third place you can go to record macros is down in the status bar in the bottom left-hand corner. If you notice, next to where it says Ready, we have a little icon just here. Now this is actually the macro recorder. Notice that when I hover my mouse over it, it says that no macros are currently recording, which is correct. Now, if you can't see that icon for some reason, it might mean that you have to right-click on the status bar and make sure that you have macro recording enabled. If you don't have a tick next to this option, then you're not going to be able to see the macro recorder in the status bar. So you can choose any one of those three methods to start recording a macro. Now we're going to start out by recording a very simple macro so you can kind of get the idea as to how this works. So let's set up our scenario. Maybe every week I need to create a weekly overview report for the sales team. And each week I type in the heading, I format the heading, and then I copy and paste the data in from another worksheet. So maybe I want to automate the process of typing out the report heading each week. Now, before I show you how to create a macro to do this, let's take a look at the number of steps it would take us to do this manually. So the first thing I would do would be to click in cell A1 and type in the heading of the report, Weekly Overview Report Sales Team. What I then might do is select the row, go to the Home tab, and then I can apply some formatting. So let's take this up so it's a little bit bigger. Let's make it bold. Maybe I want to change the background fill to blue, the font to white, and then I'm ready to copy and paste my sales data in. Now, that was probably about 6 or 7 clicks in order to get this heading to look as I want it to look. And that might not seem like a lot to you, but if you're doing this all the time, it would be much better to create a macro which will perform all of those steps with the click of one button. So let's clear everything that we've done. And this time, we're going to record the steps using the macro recorder. So I'm going to click in cell A1. I'm going to jump up to Developer and I'm going to click Record Macro. Now the Record Macro window that comes up requires us to enter a little bit of information first. For example, we need to provide a macro name. Now when you're naming your macros, it's always a good idea to make the names pretty descriptive, because if you have lots of macros in Excel over time, you want to be able to quickly find the macro that you want to run. So this macro is going to format the heading of this report. Now notice there that I'm separating those 3 words with underscores, and that's another important thing with macros. You can't have any spaces in the macro name, so it needs to be all one word or separated with underscores. Now at this stage, you can also assign a shortcut key to your macro. So if you want to quickly be able to execute the macro simply by using a quick shortcut, then you can assign that here. Now I will say you have to be a bit careful with these shortcut keys because most of the shortcuts in Excel are already taken by other commands. For example, you wouldn't want to assign the Control-C keyboard shortcut to your macro because it's going to overwrite Control-C, which is a very common keyboard shortcut used for copying. So what I generally tend to do is I like to add a Shift key into my macro shortcuts. So this shortcut key I'm going to say is Control-Shift-H. Now if you do choose a shortcut key that's already assigned to something else in Excel, you will be warned about that when you click OK on this window. Now the next thing we need to determine is where we want to store this macro. And you can see if I click the drop down, I have a couple of options. I can store it in this workbook, I can store it in a new workbook, or I can store it in the personal macro workbook. So what's the difference between these 3? Well, if I choose to store the macro just in this workbook, it means that the macro will only be accessible in this particular workbook. If I want to make the macro accessible to all of my workbooks, I would need to save it in my personal macro workbook. So that is the main difference between those 2 options. You could also choose to save this in a completely new workbook if you wanted to. Now for our examples, I'm going to choose this workbook. And then finally, we can add a description. And again, I do always like to add a description in case somebody else is looking at this report. I want them to know exactly what this macro does. So macro to format the heading of the weekly overview sales report. Now it's also worth noting that as soon as I click OK on this window, I'm into recording my macro. So from that point on, anywhere that I click will be recorded in the macro. So just make sure that you know exactly what you want to record before you're clicking the OK button. Another thing to note, if I click on OK, you can see now that on the developer ribbon, the record macro button has now changed to stop recording because I'm actually in the middle of recording a macro. Also notice that the icon in the status bar has changed to a square, and as I hover over, it says a macro is currently recording. Now, I'm being pretty careful here not to click anywhere so that I record those steps in the macro. But one thing to note, and a lot of people worry about this, is a macro doesn't record the amount of time it takes you to execute a step. So I've been sitting here for about 30 seconds or so talking away. I'm not going to have to wait 30 seconds when I run the macro for it to execute the first step. So the amount of time you take has no effect on the amount of time the macro takes to execute. So with all that said, let's start recording our steps. The first thing I want to do is click in cell A1. We're then going to type the name of the report. Let's apply some formatting. Going to select the row, up to home. We're going to take the size of the font up by 2. We're going to make the font bold, and we're going to apply a blue background fill, white font, and I'm also going to make this a little bit wider, and I'm going to align to the center. Now the final step is very important. If I was to stop recording my macro now with this first row highlighted, when I run the macro, that is exactly where the macro is going to end. So if you don't want it to end with the first row highlighted, you want to make sure you select the cell where you want your cursor to end up. So I'm going to just click in cell A2, and now I'm going to stop my macro. So up to the developer ribbon and click Stop Recording. Now, once you've finished recording your macros, they get stored underneath this macros button just here. And you can see as we hover over, it says View Macros. There is a keyboard shortcut for this of Alt F8. Now, if we click this button, this is where you're going to see all of the macros that you've created. And we have various different actions that we can take on the right hand side. We can run a macro from here, we can step into it, we can edit the VBA code, we can delete it, so on and so forth. Also notice that I'm choosing to show macros in all open workbooks. Currently, I only have this workbook open, but if I had multiple Excel files open, I could see all of the macros in all of those workbooks. If I just want to narrow it down to ones that I have in this workbook, I can just select that from the drop-down. So now that we have our macro, let's test it out and see if it works. So I'm going to create a new sheet at the bottom, and we're going to run our macro. Now remember, we did assign a keyboard shortcut to this, so I could use that, or alternatively, I can jump into macros and click the Run button, which is exactly what we're going to do here. So let's click on Run, and would you look at that, the macro has run, and we now have automated the steps to add and format our weekly overview report title. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can record a macro using relative referencing. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to give you a quick heads up about saving workbooks that contain macros. So if I try and save this workbook, which contains the macro that we created in the last lesson, notice what happens. Let's click on the Save button. I'm going to get this message pop up. What it says is the following features cannot be saved in macro-free workbooks, and then it has VB project. So basically, Excel is recognizing that we have VBA code in this workbook. And when we have VBA code and macros in a workbook, we need to save the workbook as a completely different file type. So currently, my file is saved as a .xlsx, so the default Excel file type. But for workbooks that contain macros, we must save them as macro-enabled workbooks. And you'll be able to tell if you've been sent a workbook that contains macros, because when you open it, you're going to get a yellow warning message across the top, just letting you know that your workbook has macros and asking you if you want to enable those or not. Now, the reason why this is so important is because you don't want to open a workbook that contains a macro that might have malicious code that will run on your system. So always make sure that you trust the source of where this macro-enabled workbook is coming from. Now, I know that I created this macro, so it's all good. So I'm going to click No on here, and it's going to ask me to resave. So I need to resave this workbook using a different file type. And the file type we need to save it as is this one just here, Excel macro-enabled workbook. It has a .xlsm file extension. So let's select that and click on Save. And my workbook with my macros is now saved correctly. So now let's talk about relative referencing when you're using macros. Now it's worth noting that by default, all macros are recorded using absolute referencing. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, let's take the example of the macro that we recorded in the last lesson, which basically adds and formats this report header. Now, what about if I wanted to run this macro in a different part of the workbook? So maybe I wanted this header again somewhere down here in row 18. Well, check out what happens if I click in row 18 and run this macro again. We're going to go up to the Developer tab, into Macros, and let's just click Run. Well, it doesn't look like it does anything. What it actually does is it reruns the macro and just puts the heading directly over the top of the existing heading. And that's because this macro uses absolute referencing. So it's always going to run the macro in the cells that you selected when you originally recorded the macro. So because I clicked in cell A1 and I started typing this heading out, it's always going to run that macro in cell A1. So that's not great because it doesn't provide us with much flexibility. If I want to run this macro elsewhere, for example, in row 18, I'm not going to be able to do it with the macro I've recorded in the state that it's currently in. And this is where relative referencing comes in. And if you take a look at the Developer tab in the Code group, notice that we have a button here that says Use Relative References. And what this will basically do when you select it is it will offset the starting cell. So if you've recorded a macro using relative references and you've applied it to row 1, if you then decide you want to apply it to row 18, Excel effectively uses the offset function to work out exactly which cell you want to run this macro in. So that can be really helpful. So let's create another macro and let's record it using relative references and see the difference. Now the first thing to remember here is that if you want to run a macro using relative references, you need to make sure that you enable this option prior to recording the macro. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to record a macro that adds 2 little headings in here, one that says team and one that says total. And then I'm just going to add in some dummy figures for the sales team. So we're going to turn on Use Relative References and we're going to click Record Macro. We're going to give this macro a name. We're going to call this one sales _ team _ report. Once again, we're going to assign a keyboard shortcut. This time, let's do Control-Shift-R. I'm going to store it in this workbook and let's just give it a quick description. So let's click on OK. So now I'm into recording my macro. I'm going to click in cell A3 and I'm going to type my first heading. So this is going to say team. I'm going to click in cell B3 and this is going to say total. And then I'm just going to add some data. Now let's just apply a little bit of formatting to these headings. I'm going to select both cells and we're just going to make those bold and give them an underline. Now remember, important to click on whichever cell you want your macro to end in. So I'm just going to put it here in cell A9. Let's stop recording the macro. Up to Developer, click Stop Recording. So let's see the difference when we run our macro now that we've recorded it using relative references. Now if we jump across to the test worksheet, I'm going to click over here and I'm going to run my macro. And this time I'm going to use the shortcut key that I assigned to it of Control-Shift-R. And would you take a look at that? Now the only thing I didn't add into my macro was to resize the column, so I might want to go back and maybe do something like that. But you get the idea. Now it just so happens that where I've rerun this macro is basically in exactly the same cell range as where I recorded it. So what about if I want to run this macro somewhere over here, maybe in column M? Well, let's see if it still works. Control-Shift-R. Would you take a look at that? It does. So I can now basically rerun this macro anywhere in this workbook. So that is the difference between the default, which is absolute referencing in macros, and relative referencing in macros. Make sure you know the difference and have a little practice so that you understand how this works. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can create or how we can record a more complex multi-step macro. So far, the macros that we've been recording have been fairly basic, fairly straightforward, just 1 or 2 steps. But what about if you want to completely reformat a report using a macro? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do in this lesson. Now, I will say that when you are thinking about creating a more complex macro, there are a couple of things that you should consider. The first one is that you need to really make sure that you know exactly what you need in order to complete your tasks. And that might involve jotting down the steps on a piece of paper so that you don't get halfway through recording your macro and then forget where you need to go or start clicking around the ribbons looking for a specific command. The second thing to remember is that when you do run a macro, there is no way for you to undo that macro easily. You might have noticed that when you've run macros in previous lessons, the undo button is actually grayed out. So trying to backtrack out of it requires you to go back in and manually reformat and reverse the macro changes. So in order to safeguard against this a little bit, and in order to preserve the original, I always like to make one or multiple copies of the worksheet prior to running the macro. And that's exactly what we're going to do first. So let's hold down Control and let's drag our worksheet to create a copy. And I'm actually going to create 2 copies. So let's do that again. So the data that we're going to be working on is the data on the multi-step macros worksheet. And I want to perform a few different tasks on this data. The first thing I want to do is I want to break up the customer name into 2 columns, first name and last name. I want to remove the leading 3 zeros from this order number. I want to remove the hyperlinks from the email addresses, and I also want to disguise the credit card number in column E. So I only want to display the last 4 digits, which in this case they're all the same, it doesn't matter too much, and I want all of the rest of the numbers to show as asterisks. The final thing I want to do is auto-fit the entire table. So quite a few different tasks to complete there. And we're going to put this in a macro so that we can execute all of them with the click of one button. So I'm going to click in the customer name cell in cell A5. Let's jump up to the developer ribbon and into record macro. Let's give our macro a name, reformat customer report, and I'm going to give it a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-C. Let's add a quick description. And now we can click on OK and start our macro. So the first thing I need to do here is split up the customer name into first name and last name columns. So for this, we're going to need 2 additional columns. You can use keyboard shortcuts to insert them. I'm just going to right-click, insert, right-click, insert. Now I'm going to use Flash Fill to fill these names down. So I need to provide the first one, Control Enter to stay in the cell, up to Data, and we're going to click Flash Fill. Let's go to the second column and give it the first one. Control Enter, and this time I'm going to use a different method for Flash Fill. I'm going to select all of the cells that I want to fill and use the keyboard shortcut Control E to fill those down. Now I just need to add my column headings. First name and last name. Now I can delete column A. The next thing I want to do is remove the leading zeros from the order number. Now you're going to notice in a minute when we do this that when I remove those leading zeros, Excel is going to give me some green warning triangles telling me that the number that's left is text and I should convert it to a number. Don't worry about that too much for the time being. We can always do that afterwards. So let's insert another column. And this time I'm going to use text functions. So we're going to use the right function to extract the last 5 characters from the cell. Close the bracket, Control Enter, and then we can double click to copy this down. Now I want to delete this column, so I need to paste these values. Let's Control C, go to Home, and select Paste Values. And there is my green warning triangle. Let's move this heading across, and now we can delete out column C. The next thing we want to do is remove the hyperlinks from these email addresses. So that's a simple case of selecting all of the cells, right-clicking the mouse, and then choosing Remove Hyperlinks from the right-click menu. And then finally, we want to disguise this credit card number and just show the last 4 characters, and we want everything else to be in asterisks. So at the side here, we're going to use some text functions. I'm going to put in quote marks what I want these characters to look like. So we want 4 asterisks, dash, another 4, dash, another 4. Let's close the quotes. And we want to join that with the right function because we want to extract the last 4 digits. Close the bracket, Control Enter. We can double click to copy that formula down. We're going to throw away the formula because we want to delete the column. Control C, We're going to paste those values. Let's move the heading across. And now we can delete out column F. The final thing I want to do is I want to auto-fit the entire contents. So Control A to select the table, up to the Home tab, into Format, and I'm going to say Auto-fit column width. And I want my cursor to end up in cell A1. Let's stop the macro recorder. So quite a few steps there. Let's test it out on one of our other worksheets. So if we jump across to multi-step macros 2, remember this is where we have our original data, let's run the macro. So I'm going to go into macros, choose run, and would you take a look at that? Like magic, it's applied all of those steps. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the VBA Editor. Now, what exactly is VBA? Well, VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications, and you find it in all Microsoft applications because it's the language that sits behind the application, and it's mainly used for programming, editing, and running application code. So effectively, when you create a macro, what you're essentially creating is VBA code. So it's important that you at least understand the VBA Editor window. And whilst you might not get to the stage where you're writing your own macros from scratch using VBA, it is good to be able to understand how to jump into a macro that you've created and make minor changes by tweaking the code. Now, the workbook that we're currently in contains lots and lots of different macros. In fact, there is a macro for each of these worksheets that does different things. For example, the first macro that was run on this worksheet deleted all blank rows. The one on the second worksheet applied a counting format. We then have a macro that formatted this data as a table. Another one that pasted values. The next one added some data bars to a data set. And then we have one that removed hyperlinks from URLs. We also have a macro in here that creates a new blank worksheet. So we have about 7 or 8 macros in this workbook. Now, if we want to see the code that sits behind these macros, this is where we jump into the VBA Editor. And there are a few ways that you can get to it. So the first way is that we could go up to the Developer tab, and in the Code group, we could click this icon just here, Visual Basic. And you can see there the second way that we can get to the VBA Editor, and that is by using the shortcut key of Alt plus F11. So let's click it to open up the window. Now I'm going to maximize this out to make it a bit easier to see, but this is essentially where all of the code is stored for each of the macros. And the VBA Editor window is really made up of lots of other different windows. For example, on the left-hand side, we have the VBA project pane. So this is where you can see your workbook and all of the macros contained within that workbook. For example, at the top here, you can see we've got the current file name, which is 1105 VBA Editor.xlsm. That's my workbook name. And then underneath, you can see all of the sheets with the sheet name in brackets. And then right at the bottom, we have this modules folder, which currently says module 1. And if we double click on module 1, that's basically going to open the code for all of the macros that we have in this workbook. And you can see that's exactly what I have loaded up in the main project window. Now, one thing you'll notice about the VBA Editor is that it is kind of old school in its appearance. If you remember back before we had the ribbons in our Microsoft applications, we were using a menu system. And that is exactly what we still have in the VBA Editor window. For example, if I click Format, I get a drop-down menu and offshoot menus containing my commands. I also have toolbars, old school toolbars, as opposed to ribbons. Now, if we just take a quick look at the code, let's understand what we're looking at. Because the thing is, with VBA code, it's not particularly difficult code to understand, and there are definitely some edits that you can make without really having any programming knowledge. So at the top here, you can see the first macro, which is called delete blank rows. And this is the macro which, as you would expect, deletes blank rows from a dataset. Now your macros will always start with sub and then the macro name. And you'll notice right at the end of this macro, which is just where we have this line, we will always finish with end sub. Anything you see in green is a comment. And comments in general are kind of like notes in a way that you can add into your macro code to give people more of an idea as to what the macro does and any other helpful information that you might want to add. And comments not only appear in green, but you'll also see that they have an apostrophe at the beginning. And that basically tells VBA not to run these as pieces of code. They're just comments. So if you do want to type any notes at the top of your macro and give your users some advice or some information about how to use this macro, simply make sure you add an apostrophe before you type your text. Underneath, we then have the code which needs to run in order to delete blank rows. So let's take a look at this code. Now this first line of code, which ends in .select, this is as you would expect. It's simply making a selection. So it's selecting the cell range A18 to M22. I can see that then in the macro, I clicked on the cell E18 and then I selected columns A to M. We then have a line of code which basically says select all of the blanks, and then underneath we are deleting the entire row before ending up in cell A2. So if I wanted to make a minor modification, maybe I decide that instead of my cursor finishing in cell A2 when I run the macro, I want it to finish in cell B10, I could simply modify this cell reference in here. So I could change that to B10. And effectively, I've modified my macro code. So let's save this and rerun the delete blank rows macro. I'm going to click on save on the toolbar. I'm going to close down the VBA window and we're going to go to the delete blank rows workbook. So let's add some in. I'm just going to insert one there. Let's insert another one here and another one just here. So now I'm going to rerun the macro, and what we should find is that instead of our cursor ending up in cell A1, we should find it ends up in B10. So let's jump up to macros. Let's find delete blank rows and click run. Take a look at that. Those blank rows have been deleted and look where my cursor is. It's in B10. So we can immediately see how that small change to the VBA code has affected the macro. Let's jump back into Visual Basic. So this is reasonably simple code to understand. And all of this has been generated simply by me recording a macro. Now, if we scroll down to the next macro, and you can see that it's separated by a line, this is the one that applies a counting format. Again, we just have the name of the macro in green as a comment. And this one is basically applying custom number formatting to 3 columns. And if you remember back to when we covered custom number formatting, this is basically what we have here. We're specifying the format for positive, negative, 0 values, and text. So for a lot of macros that you run, the code isn't particularly hard to understand. Of course, VBA can get quite complex, and you definitely do need to know how to write it if you want to start to write your own macros from scratch. But I will say that for the most part, you're going to be using the macro recorder to generate your VBA code. But it's good to have an understanding as to how to jump into this VBA editor, have an idea as to what you're looking at, and also be aware of how you can make minor changes. In this lesson, we're going to record a couple of macros to sort and filter this data, and then I'm going to show you how you can assign macros to clickable buttons to make it super easy for your users to execute the macros. Because let's face it, if you're sharing this workbook with other members in your team, it's not particularly user-friendly that if they want to sort this data in a specific way, they need to go up into macros, find the correct macro, and then run it. What would be much better would be just to have a clickable button, which makes it really obvious what they need to do. Now, before we get on to creating the buttons, we need to create the macros. So I'm going to create 3 macros. The first macro is going to sort this data by the department and the hire date. The second macro is going to filter the list by job title. And the third macro is going to clear the filters. So let's first record our macros. So let's jump up to record macro. And this first macro is going to sort our data by department and hire date. So let's give it an appropriate name. So I'm going to call this sort by depth and hire date. Just for quickness sake, I'm not going to assign a shortcut key. I'm going to store it in this workbook and we won't add a description for now. As I said, I'm just trying to save a little bit of time here. I would recommend that you add both of these things. Let's click on OK. So now I'm recording my macro. So I'm going to click in the department column. I'm going to go up to home and we're going to jump in to our custom sort, because I want to sort on two columns. So the first column I want to sort by is the department. I want to sort on the values in the cells, and I want to sort the departments A to Z. I want to add another level because I then want to sort by the hire date, and let's say newest to oldest, and click on OK. Let's jump up to the developer ribbon and stop recording. The next macro I want to record is a filter macro. So I want it to filter the job title to only show me details for the sales assistants. So let's do record macro. This one I'm going to call filter by job title. Let's click on OK. And now we can click the drop down next to job title. I'm going to deselect everything and only select sales assistant and click on OK. Let's stop recording our macro. Now the final macro that I want to create is one that's going to reverse what we just did and clear the filter. So let's jump up to record macro and we're just going to call this one clear filter. Let's click on OK. Let's go to our drop down and select clear filter from job title. Stop recording the macro. So now I have three macros sitting here that I can apply to my data. And let's just try out one of these. Let's do the filter by job title again. If I select it and click run, it's going to apply the filter. If we go back into macros and say clear filter, let's run that one, it's going to put everything back. Now, of course, if I try to run the sort by department and hire date, I actually already have that applied. So when I click run, it's not going to look like it does anything. But if you were to try using this on an unsorted set of data, then that's going to work. So now that we have our three macros, let's assign them to a user-friendly clickable button. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you could do this. You could simply insert a shape, so maybe one that looks like a button, maybe something like a rounded rectangle, and assign a macro to a shape. That is perfectly fine. But what I want to do is basically create something that looks a little bit more like a button. So for this, we're going to use form controls. So if we go up to the Developer tab, into Insert, notice that under Form Controls, we have this one here called Button. So let's select it, and I'm going to draw a button on the page. And I want 3 of these, so let's make sure we get these the right size. Now notice, as soon as I let go, it gives me the option to assign a macro. So this first one is going to sort by department and hire date. Let's click on OK. So now I have my button and I can edit that button title. And I'm going to drag that out a little bit more so everything fits on nicely. And there we go, we have our first clickable button. Now, if you want to move these around, it's a bit difficult because as soon as you click on these buttons, it's going to execute that macro. But if you right click, that's going to allow you to select the button and then you can reposition it. Let's draw another button. So up to Developer, I'm going to grab another one and we're going to draw that in here. And you can spend a little bit more time aligning these and getting these exact than I am here. Let's assign this macro the filter by job title. Click on OK. I'm going to make this a little bit taller. And once again, we can edit the button name. And then the final button that we want to add is just one that's going to clear that filter. So let's draw our button out. Let's assign the clear filter macro. Click on OK. double click, and this one is clear filter. Now remember, if you want to align these perfectly, you can use your alignment tools and you can spend a bit more time resizing these to get them exact. But let's see how these work. As I said, if we click sort by department and hire date, that one's already applied. But what about if I click filter by sales assistant? That one's working perfectly. If I want to clear the filter, I have a button there and it's going to execute that macro. So that's a really nice, quick and easy way to assign macros to form control buttons to make them easier for your users to execute. In the last lesson, we saw how we can assign macros to useful clickable buttons to make it super easy for our users to execute those macros. But that isn't the only way that we can make it easy to execute macros, not only for our users, but also for ourselves. We can also add macros to the quick access toolbar. And if we have a lot of macros that we're using every single day, we could even think about creating our own macro ribbon. So let's take a look at both of these options. Now the quick access toolbar, as we know, is this little toolbar that I have underneath my ribbons. You might have it above in the top left-hand corner, but this basically contains commands that you use frequently. And we saw in the beginner's Excel course how we can customize this ribbon with all of our favorite, most useful commands. So how can we add our macros to this ribbon? Well, it's a pretty straightforward process. All we need to do is click the drop down at the end and go into More Commands. Now this is going to jump us across to Excel options. And helpfully, it's jumped us straight onto the correct page, which is the Quick Access Toolbar page. On the right-hand side, we can see our Quick Access Toolbar and all of the icons that we currently have on there. And then on the left-hand side, we have a big long list of all of the commands available in Excel. Now you'll notice at the top it says choose commands from, and then we have popular commands selected. But if we click the drop down just here, notice that we can choose macros. And this is going to show all of the macros that you have in this workbook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add all of these macros to my Quick Access Toolbar. So let's select the first one, click the Add button, second one, Add, third one, Add. And what I'm also going to do is add a separator, and I'm going to move that separator up so that it separates my macros from some of the other icons that I have on that toolbar. Now you'll notice currently each of these macros has the default name of the macro and also a default icon. Now you can modify these details if you need to. Notice underneath we have a modify button, so if I click this, it's going to allow me to choose a different icon, and I can also change the display name. So maybe I want to give it more of a user-friendly display name. So let's just say sort by department and hire date, which is basically the same, we just don't have the underscores. And maybe I want to assign this icon just here. Let's click on OK. And I can do exactly the same for the others. So let's click on Modify. I'm going to say Filter by Job Title, and let's give this a little funnel icon. And then we'll go to Clear Filter. Let's modify. Again, I'm just going to remove the underscore from this. And I'm going to give this one a little clear icon. So now if I click on OK, you can see that I have these macros assigned to my Quick Access Toolbar. So if I click on the funnel icon, it's going to run that macro, and I can then clear the macro from here as well. Now in a similar way, I could create my own ribbon that houses all of my macros. So this is particularly useful if you have a lot of macros in your workbook and you want to have them all easily accessible on a ribbon. So once again, we need to go into Excel options to do this. So let's click on File. Let's go down to Options. And this time we're going to click on Customize Ribbon. So on the right hand side, we have all of the ribbons that we currently have active in Excel. And right at the bottom, I have some action buttons. So I can create a new tab, a new group, and I can rename. So what I'm going to do is create a new tab, and then I'm going to rename this tab. So let's select it and click on Rename, and I'm going to call this My Macros. And that's basically going to be my ribbon. Now we know that when we're using ribbons, not only do we have the ribbon, we have different groups. So for example, I'm clicked on the View ribbon at the moment, and my commands are stored in groups. So the first group is Workbook Views, the second group is Show, the third group is Zoom, so on and so forth. So you can create your own groups on your ribbon as well. So where we have New Group underneath, I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this Sorting and Filtering. Let's click on OK. So now I have my tab, my group set up. All I need to do is add my macros. So on the left hand side of the screen, we're going to go back to macros, and we're just simply going to add these. So let's click Add, and we just select and carry on adding. And once again, I can go in and give these better names. So let's rename. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Let's give it this icon, and I'm going to go through and apply the same settings that we applied previously. So let's rename this one Filter by Job Title, and let's give it a filter icon. And then finally, we're going to rename this to Clear Filter. So let's just remove that underscore, and we're going to choose the clear icon. So now when I click on OK, take a look at my ribbons. I have a new ribbon called My Macros, and when I click on it, I have a sorting and filtering group, and there are my macros. It might be that you want to give these a little bit of a shorter name so that they're not so squashed in there, but these are still going to work. So if we click on Filter by Job Title, it runs the macro, we can clear the filter. And I could go through and add other groups which contain other macros that do different things. So you can really customize your copy of Excel, automate all of your tedious tasks, and then make those macros easily accessible, either by adding them to the Quick Access toolbar or creating your own custom macro ribbon. In the final lesson of this section, we're going to do something which will lead us quite nicely into the final section of the course. And that is, I'm very quickly going to show you how you can use AI tools, in this case Microsoft Copilot, to generate VBA code for you. As you can imagine, this is a complete game changer. Instead of having to learn how to write VBA code, you can simply get AI tools to generate it for you. Now, as I mentioned, my tool of choice is going to be Copilot in Bing, but you could equally do this using something like ChatGPT. So let's take a look at a basic example. Now on the screen here, I have some data. This is just some information about Winter Olympic athletes. And you can see that currently it's not really formatted. Now, in a real world scenario, it wouldn't take me too long to reformat this manually. I could apply bold headings, I could resize the columns. But if this is something that I had to do on a daily or weekly basis, this is the perfect candidate for automation using VBA Code. So what I want to do here is I want to use VBA to bold the heading row, to resize or auto-fit all rows and columns, and then export this as a PDF and save it to my desktop. So let's jump across to Copilot and type in our prompt. Now, if you've never used Copilot before, this is the free version of Copilot. So all you need to do is open up a browser. I've got Edge open and go to copilot.microsoft.com. And this has a very similar interface to ChatGPT. You simply type in your prompt at the bottom, send it through. So I've already constructed my prompt, so let's read through it. And remember, with prompts, the more detailed and explicit you are, the better. So my prompt is, I have an Excel worksheet named Athletes, containing a table with the following fields: name, sport, nationality, age, and weight kg. Can you please generate VBA code to auto-fit all rows and columns in the sheet, bold the header row, and save to my desktop? And then I've listed out the exact path of my desktop as a PDF file. Please provide step-by-step instructions. So I've added that part onto the end so that it tells me exactly the steps I need to take in order to achieve this. So let's send this through by clicking the submit button. Copilot's going to go away. It's going to think about it for a few moments. And check it out. It's now generating the VBA code. Then underneath the code is going to give me some step-by-step instructions. So it's telling me to implement this, I need to open my Excel workbook that contains the athletes worksheet. I need to press Alt 11 to open the Visual Basic for Applications editor. I need to insert a new module by clicking Insert Module and then copy and paste the VBA code into the module. And then it gives me some instructions here. Modify the worksheet name if it's different from athletes. So if for some reason I'd renamed the worksheet, I would need to modify the VBA code. I then need to save my workbook and close the VBA editor. So let's do that. I'm going to scroll up to where we have the code, and we don't have to select it this way. We have a copy code button on the right hand side. So let's click copy and let's go back to Excel. So now I need to open up the VBA editor. We're going to go to the developer tab and click on Visual Basic. Remember, you can press Alt F11 to do the same thing. So we want to make sure that we have the correct sheet selected, Sheet 1 Athletes. We're going to right click and we're going to insert a new module. And then all I'm going to do is press Ctrl V to paste that VBA code in. Let's give it a save by clicking the Save button, and then I can close the VBA window down. So let's give it a test. I'm going to go into macros. There is the macro that it's created. It's called it Format and Save as PDF. So if I choose Run, it's going away, it's working, it's reformatted it in the Excel worksheet, and I'm getting a message box telling me worksheet formatted and saved as PDF, and then we have the location. So let's jump across there and take a look. So there we are, I'm on my desktop, it's created a file called athletes.pdf, and if I double click to open it, there is my nicely formatted PDF file generated by Microsoft Copilot. What do you think of that? I think it's pretty cool. This opens up so many possibilities when it comes to working with VBA in Excel. It's no longer necessary to know exactly how to code VBA, but it is helpful to know your way around at least the VBA editor, so that if you do have to make any modifications or amendments, you know what you're doing. This leads us very nicely into the final section of the course, which is taking a look at AI tools. It's time now to do exercise 9. And in this exercise, we're going to practice some of the skills that we've learnt in this section of the course. And in this section, we were taking a look at macros and VBA. So the first thing I'd like you to do here is I'd like you to create 2 copies of this worksheet. And on the first worksheet, I'd like you to create a macro to completely reformat this data set. And the macro should do the following: auto-fit columns, apply currency formatting to columns I and J, format the data as a table, turn off banded rows, apply a light grey background fill colour to column J, and the macro needs to finish in cell B1. I'd then like you to add a button and label it Reformat Data. And I'd like you to attach the macro to that button. Then on one of the other copies that you've made, I'd like you to test the button is working and you don't get any errors. And if you'd like to do a little bit of a bonus exercise, see if you can work out how to change the VBA code so that the macro finishes in a different cell. If you'd like to see my answer, then download the solution file from the exercise files folder.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.